Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. Hey, did you know my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation? Head over to setitonfire.co to learn more. Well, my guest today is Ed Fidoe. Ed is the founder and CEO of London Interdisciplinary School, or LIS, and LIS is the first institution in decades to be granted degree awarding powers from the inception in the UK. It offers an innovative interdisciplinary curriculum focused on tackling complex global issues such as inequality, sustainability, ethics, and AI. Before this, Ed co-founded a couple other things, and we're going to jump in and talk about those things today. I think what you need to know about Ed is he's right in our space, innovative, creating from the ground up, and excited to have you on the podcast, Ed.
Thanks, Natalie. Good to be here.
Before we jump into what you're doing today, you've co-founded before, and it sounds like you're just at home with our audience here, starting things from the ground up. So I'd love for us to just spend a few more minutes on your background and some of the things you founded before LIS, and also where's the passion to do this come from?
Yeah, I sometimes ask myself that. And actually, if we go back a little bit to when I was younger, when I was a kid, so when I was 9, 10 years old, I was at a very sort of traditional school in the East Midlands. It was a wonderful school, but it was quite traditional, focused on exams, quite a small school. But I got a part in a TV show, which I was then in for about 5 or 6 years. We would film in the summer and then I'd go back to the school in the rest of the year. And I think this TV show where I turned into a dog, believe it or not, kind of gave me this idea that sort of anything's possible, or rather it demystified a lot of things that for young people, and then in the end, lots of people, they sort of seem almost mystical. The idea of being on television seems impossible to a lot of people. The idea of starting a business might seem unlikely or impossible, but this was sort of demystified for me. So, I went to university and did engineering, but whilst I was there, I started a theatre production company, obviously drawing a bit on my background as doing acting. I was a management consultant for a bit at McKinsey, but I left McKinsey to start a school, so a K-12 school, 4 to 18 school in East London. That was in 2010. I quit my job in 2010. We opened in 2012. And similarly to the university we started, we wanted to look at education completely differently. So School 21 was the school that opened in 2012. And we had a big focus on project-based learning, a big focus on speaking skills, or Oracy. So yeah, that was another educational, innovative model that I set up.
So as I listen to you talk about the foundation of starting that school, that feels pretty obvious to me that that is the direction everything is going. And yet our school systems are so far behind some of those things. They're not actually catching up. I mean, here in the States, we're definitely not focused in our school systems on project-based learning a lot of times, or even being able to communicate. And there's a quote by a famous person, I can't remember who, but they said, if I could have gone back to school, I would have focused on the ability to communicate ideas and the ability to speak. And so I love what you're talking about here, because this is innovative in the space, because this is not, especially in the US, the way that our school systems are set up to function.
Well, it's not really how the UK is set up either. And it was you have charter schools in the US, a much more mature system there than is in the UK. We sort of, that was the 2010 legislation meant that we could start this School 21. So we had more freedom in that model, but there's only about 400 schools like that in the UK total, right? And there's 25,000 schools that are governed in different ways. So they don't have the same freedoms. It's interesting. Some things in education that seem obvious actually catch fire and other schools take them on, and other things we found don't. So with project-based learning, we found that other schools really struggled to take on the examples of what we were doing at School 21. It's also very hard to do project-based learning well. It's actually quite often done very poorly, and it'll often therefore has an effect of being worse for learning than traditional methods, honestly. But done brilliantly, it is kind of an order of magnitude better in my view. Oracy, the speaking skills part of it, has really caught on. So there's now over 1,000 schools in the UK that work with the charity that span out of the school, Voice 21. There's 1,000 schools in the UK working with that charity, trying to raise the status of speaking in schools, because it should have a similar speaking status to reading and writing, but it doesn't in schools, right? You could pretty much go through your school life not saying a single word out loud, and in many schools that's almost true, and get pretty good grades, but you'd struggle in the workplace. So that was the sort of philosophy was, of course, speaking is important. There's very little focus on it in schools. You're not assessed on it. But it's a great place, particularly if you're from a socially economically disadvantaged background. What a great opportunity to work with young people to help them in that field.
That's so amazing to think about how we're innovating and thinking about education. As I was reading out your bio, I noticed that AI was a big part of that bio. I would love to know within the space that you are now, how are you guys approaching AI, the ethics around it? How are you treating that as part of the school program?
Well, I mean, now LIS, that's a university, although it says school in the title, because we can't call ourselves a university for another 3 or 4 years. So that's just a bureaucratic thing. But we're a university, and like schools, we're really wrestling with how to integrate AI. And there's different ways of thinking about it. So there is can we use it to do assessments in more intelligent ways? Can the students use it? Should we allow the students to use it in their assignments? Can we, use it to do better teaching and so on? And I think perhaps the most important thing, and the thing which we've made the most progress on, is in how students use it in the work that they do. Now, if you start with a philosophy, a principle, which is if we're genuinely preparing people for the world of work, is at least part of what a university's got to be doing, okay, as well as kind of just passing on all the great thoughts that have ever been thought, then you need to have them using the AI tools of the day. Otherwise, we're really setting them up to fail in the real world. They should come out of university at least the same level as everybody else and arguably ahead of people. So we say, great, you've got to use the AI tools. You've got to use ChatGPT and so on in your essay or assignment, but you've got to declare it. You've got to talk about how you used it. You've got to talk about how it made your work more accurate or more creative, generally higher standard. Talk us through the drafts. And we often do this, back to speaking skills. You do this often in a sort of Viva situation where you're talking and discussing it with a student. It's quite hard to fake you can't use ChatGPT in the middle of a discussion, right? So to help you. So we sort of mix the use of AI tools with quite old-fashioned talking in person, which takes a lot of time. We try and get the students to communicate the process of how they've used the tools, and then we kind of grade them on that. And I think now our expectations for what students should be able to produce should raise. We should, if you want to get a first-class degree now, you really should be looking at an extraordinary piece of work, because if people have got these tools to help them, our expectations should go alongside that.
Wow, that's powerful. I mean, I think about you're right. So in our school system, right, I think a lot of universities here in the US have declared it's a zero tolerance policy. You're not allowed to use AI. And then you get into the real world and you're using AI. And so being able to help them use AI as a mental sparring partner, be able to defend why they use that information, why did they think it was valuable, and how did it enrich the overall body of work that they're trying to produce. I think that's very powerful because that's exactly what would happen in the real world. We would produce something, you would sit in front of for example, I'm a consultant, so I would sit in front of a client and explain the work, why we did it this way. And then oftentimes we'd have to defend that work, right? Well, why did you go left instead of right? Why did you go up instead of down? So all of these things I think are the closer we can get students to the real world, I think the more applicable what they're learning today will be. And it's interesting, even in my daughter's school, she's going into ninth grade or she's in ninth grade and they're giving her a personal finance class. And I was relieved to hear that because, again, those are the things that you're like, yeah, you're going to have to figure out how to manage a bank account, know what's in there. So, as much as we can take what's happening today and pull that into education, oftentimes, and we hear this a lot, is at least in the US, is that there's such a disparate gap between what I'm learning in school and then when I came in the real world and tried to apply that. And so it sounds like you guys are trying to get that gap closed as much as possible.
Yeah. I mean, look, this is central to a lot of what I've been trying to do over the last 15 years or so, which is at School 21, we're trying to say, how can we have young people understand what doing work of value means? And by doing that, by saying work of value, we mean work that has some value to somebody else. And if you think about your time in school, you're very rarely doing that. You're revising, you're learning. It's useful to you, which is, of course, important. It's not useful to your teacher that you're learning these things or doing this work. It's not useful to your classmates. It's not useful to anybody else, only useful to you. So the vast majority of work you do at school, probably 99%, I would class things like school plays and performances. That's entertaining other people. So that is of value to other people, right? Depending on how good the play is. But 99% of the work is for you. It's not for anyone else. And then you leave and you go into the real world And all anybody wants is you to give them work of value to them, right? And so it's this huge cognitive shift which we're asking young people to make. It's the same at universities. We very rarely do work that's of value to other people. So at LIS, which is this new university, we organize all of the learning around complex problems rather than around a single disciplinary area. And we ask the students to be applying kind of that learning to real problems. We bring in real companies with their problems that they've got in the areas of ethics and AI, or the areas of sustainability or inequality, or sort of urban issues that they've got, which are complex problems that require an interdisciplinary approach. And the students are getting used to dealing with real, messy problems, where it's often hard to apply the academic thinking. Often it's challenging to do that, but they're getting used to that in their time at university, so that they're more ready to do that in the real world.
Wow. This is so fascinating. I love what we're talking about here. As you think about success stories, what would you say when you think about how this has been put into practice? What would you say are some success stories of places where you really see this come into play and you really see it working well?
Well, I mean, so we're quite young. We're new. We had our first students enroll in 2021, and as I sit here now, tomorrow is the graduation of those students. So we're really
Wow.
excited. So yeah, middle of September. We're Friday the 13th September. Those students graduate. So Friday the 13th, odd choice of day, but anyway, they're graduating, and we're really excited about it. So there are already some emerging examples, and let me tell you about a couple. So one of our students, as his third year project, was looking at football commentary. By football, I mean soccer commentary in the UK, and trying to identify any kind of racial biases in the commentary. And so he took huge recordings, like lots of recordings of lots of kind of football matches, used natural language processing tools to analyze and see patterns in this. Obviously had to tag against whether the player was an ethnic minority or a white player and so on, and started to find, and then had to kind of create visual representation of that data and tell the story that actually there is a lot of racial bias. So he found that commentators were more likely to refer to a player as being an intelligent player, words like kind of using guile and so on, if they were a white player. Whereas if they were a player of color, it would often be they were strong, or they were fast, right? So more physical attributes. So this is, when there's no reason to believe that there are any differences between, those players at all. So this was really powerful. And he is now, next week, I think, going up to Manchester up in the UK to talk to some people who work in football, in the Football Association, to talk about his research. He's a third year undergrad student, right? He's 21 years old. So he's looking at a real problem. It's a real thing. It's a problem that he identified. Okay, it's quite small in its own way, quite specific. But this is the thing. He's done an interdisciplinary degree, but he is now probably the country's leading expert on racial bias in football commentary. Let's say because he's done this very specific piece of analysis which hasn't been done before. The other example, I mean, there's lots of examples like that, because all the students are doing projects which are wildly different from each other. They just have to identify a complex problem they want to interrogate. And then our students are starting to get jobs. And then you see the range of jobs the students are leaving. They've done the same degree, but some are going to work in our NHS, our healthcare system. Some are going to work for Goldman Sachs. Some are going to work for kind of sustainability startups, and everything in between, government, so on. So anywhere where the employers are wrestling with complex problems.
I love this. I mean, I'm just thinking through how my college years would have been different if I could have actually dealt with real problems in college and not just studied in books. And, even my MBA was the first chance I had we went over to India and engaged with a CEO of a company and helped him solve a problem.
Cool.
And I loved it. And the idea that they're doing this now, sooner and sooner and sooner in their career, I love this connection to the real world and how it actually creates the world and the thinkers that we need in the world. And we need them thinking about hard problems. And before they get all the bad habits built in, we need them thinking about hard problems. And I love this because over time, the older you get, you do build biases and bad habits in a certain way, right? That is very set that you see the world. And so just how do you break that? You expose people to more different types of people, different types of problems, different questions to ask. And I think that just broadens people's mindset so specifically. So let's talk a little bit about interaction expertise, because I love this word, but I'd love for you to break it down for our audience and then tell them a little bit about, how does that help you solve modern problems?
Sure. So I've talked a bit about our undergraduate program, but we do a lot of work with kind of middle leaders. So people who are in their, let's say, sort of early 30s through to mid 40s, who are starting to manage people who are doing a job that they don't necessarily understand fully, right? So they're managing people who have got a skill set that you don't necessarily have, which, when I was doing consultancy, everybody had the same skill set. Everyone had been a junior consultant and now they're a senior consultant. But in many, many organizations, that's not the case. Interactional expertise is this idea of expertise that it exists between being a kind of contributory expert. So that's a sort of scientist who's doing contributory work at the coalface and publishing papers is one example. And then between them and a kind of generalist who has a very shallow knowledge of science, to use science as an example. Somebody with interactional expertise is between those two areas. They might be a science journalist. So they can write about science and be intelligent. They may actually look like an proper expert to a generalist. They can understand the jokes the scientists are selling to each other. But what's powerful is that they may also have interactional expertise in other areas, especially journalists. If we stick with that example, they could be a sports journalist, perhaps in their last brief. Perhaps they're also doing a kind of European brief as well as the science brief, right? And so what they can do, which is hugely powerful, is make connections between these different areas because they have interactional expertise in these areas. And we get a little shy, and this is not just a British thing, although I think it is a bit British. When you're not a kind of full-blown expert, done the degree, got the T-shirt, all that, you kind of say, oh, well, I don't really know much about this, right? But actually, it's more powerful to sort of identify the expertise you have as being of use. You've got an interactional expertise in a certain area. Now, how can you actually use this if you're working in a company? First of all, is to have a sit down. If you think you're just a generalist and you're a bit embarrassed by that, and you kind of wish you were a subject matter expert, jot down a few of the areas where you have interactional expertise. I'm, as the CEO of this organization, I'm trying to build interactional expertise in marketing. I don't think it's okay for me to just delegate that to my head of marketing, right? I need interactional expertise in that area. I need interactional expertise in various areas of academia to be able to talk to the different faculty in this interdisciplinary institution, and that's difficult. But you can consciously start to build up the areas where you think you need some interactional expertise, and not just sort of give up and say, well, I'd need to study that area for a decade to be a true expert in it. So we find even just naming this as a thing can be hugely revealing for people, sort of settles them. And they think, oh, that's actually what I've been doing these last 20 years as a knowledge economy worker. I've been building interactional expertise in a range of areas. And as a consultant, you'll know that, that's a lot of the power of what consultants bring.
Yeah. Yeah. You see a lot of different patterns over a number of different companies and people over time. And eventually you can, even though the industry may change, you can begin to spot those patterns. I love this term because I think what it does too is it helps generalists feel like there is something to what they do and how they do it. And being able to synthesize information really quickly is what I think makes a generalist successful. Somebody who can interact in a number of different settings and pick up pretty quickly on what are the nuances of like you said, the jokes, for example, or what are the nuances of the terms that are being used. And so that's a very powerful skill set to hold, even if you do go more specifically into just one area, if you will. As you're looking at the trends of this, I mean, what do you see for the future of education? Do you see people desiring to be more of that generalist, or do you see people desiring to focus really on a specific area of expertise over time?
Well, it depends how we define what the area of focus is. So what I think people are doing in the UK education system, which is the one I understand the best, is that people are going to university, in my view, a little too much for the credential rather than the knowledge. That's the first thing. Yep. So they're optimizing to get the credential, which means they're optimizing to get into the prestigious institution. And to get into the prestigious institution to study, let's say, chemistry, they think they need to just study sciences at A-level. I know it's different in different parts of the world, but in the UK, we do 3-4 A-levels. They choose all sciences for those A-levels to prove that just desperately just want to study chemistry for 3 years. I think this is really bad for society. Now, sort of specializing in something is not a problem. But what we have at the minute is a bunch of people all specializing in these kind of disciplinary areas, which are really only invented to kind of organize libraries. They're not actual things, right? So they are literally just a way of organizing knowledge to categories. They're not problems or jobs. They don't map onto these things, physics and biology and history don't, unless you're going to be an academic, they don't map onto jobs. So they're not actually that useful to have people specializing in them. I think what I would like to see, and I hope happens, is that people start to think, no, I'm going to organize myself more around a problem. Mm-hmm. So let's say for the student at LIS who's graduating tomorrow on football commentary, racial bias, he's like, that's a problem. I'm interested in the problem of racism in sport, right? That's a big area. There'll be lots of jobs in that area, sadly, still, I'm sure, for some time. and he's picked a part of it. And he's actually now kind of a specialist in that little area because there's not many people looking at it. And he's combining an unusual combination of skills to bring to bear, different sorts of analysis, different kinds of disciplinary lenses to look at that problem. And he's suddenly become a specialist. So I think what we need is people, of course, being specialists, but in a much more heterogeneous, a much more kind of random range of things than organizing into the kind of 10, 15 main subjects.
Well, I take his specific skill set, for example, and I think about the fact that in 2020, I was working with the government as part of a consulting project on transforming the justice system in their space. And I think a lot of the work that he is working on could be easily applied to the justice system. And so oftentimes what was happening is they were making what they felt were an incremental change. And that incremental change here would actually create a bigger challenge here. And they thought, hey, let's have less interaction with what they call the BIPOC community. And when they created that less interaction, when interaction happened, it was actually, there was a bigger challenge with that interaction. Now it was more kind of extreme than they would have had before. So it's almost the linguistic patterns, all the things that go into like, how did we get where we got? It's pretty powerful that you could take that and apply that to sports, but it could also be lifted and applied in so many different areas. And that challenge analyzed in so many different spaces. And so what I love about that example is while it is very specific to sports, you could almost take the model that he's using, zoom out, and apply it across governments, apply it across businesses. There's so many use cases to an example like that, and how we can take his, the research or the mental model he used to kind of build to where he got to say, well, how would we apply that and solve the problem in these other areas too? And so that to me sounds extremely powerful way to kind of approach this work and think about the work in the world around you.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's great to hear. And that's the idea. And these are highly transferable skills. We're essentially teaching these methods. They're quantitative and as well as qualitative methods. So the idea is people come out not just saying, well, I don't really like maths, I'm more of a kind of artsy person. We're going to have to wrestle with all of these, all of the topics, all of the skills, all of the methods to tackle the problems we face in the world. So yeah, those skills and those methods should be transferable to lots of different problems. But it's great to hear your example of the legal system. Yeah, I'll pass that on.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about communication as kind of the last piece. We touched on it a little bit. You've talked about how important it is. I would love to know more about how do you get communication and the skill of presenting, the skill of connecting with your audience, making sure your material connects with the people you're presenting it to. Talk more about how that's built into the way that the courses are designed or the way that the school is designed.
Yeah, so we've actually focused more on that. We focus more on that at School 21 than we have done at LIS. I'd actually wish we'd done a little more of it. We still can, of course. I'm still the chief exec. We can do a little more of it at LIS. There's always a kind of risk of trying to do too much in the early days. But we did it from day one at School 21, and we saw huge progress there. The first thing is to have a kind of framework, a kind of way of looking at speech. What I tend to find is that if young people do a talk, people will typically they give feedback around look up a bit more, speak up a bit more, be a bit clearer. And after that, people kind of run out of ideas about what to say as feedback. Okay. Now, if you give people a framework, it depersonalizes it and also helps them kind of organize better feedback. So we have this framework, very simple, Oracy framework, which said you can comment on their kind of physical attributes of their talk, the linguistic aspects of their talk, kind of content of it, the cognitive aspect of it, and the social and emotional aspect of it, which is a bit about connecting, if you like. And so then you can start to give more sophisticated feedback. You've got one child who is kind of walking around shyly in a circle, looking at her shoes nervously, but actually the content of what she's saying is kind of brilliant. You can say, well, physically poor, socioeconomically, it's sort of social connection, lots of work to do. But linguistically, your words were very good for this audience, and the structure and the argument was very well made. Likewise, the sort of very charismatic young boy who's kind of making eye contact and cracking jokes, but actually it's all gibberish. Again, you can give really good feedback. You can say, yeah, physically strong and powerful, and so on. So that we felt really unlocks it for teachers. And students can actually give each other feedback in that sense as well. The most important thing we did in the school was to show that we valued it in the students' work, and we valued teachers who spent time on it. And we would make sure that it was happening in all the classes. So our maths teachers and our science teachers were focused on Oracy just as much as our drama teachers and our English and language teachers. And so you would go into a classroom and you would see students stood in two lines facing each other, explaining mathematical problems to each other in pairs. Quite some physicality around it as well, and kind of movement. It kind of really helps. We had assemblies that happened in the round, in a circle, rather than in rows, looking up at somebody standing on a stage, giving announcements. And the students were therefore, it was democratized, and the students would speak as a large part of the assembly. There would be a lot. So you're showing that you're both giving them space to practice. But actually, I think the most important thing is, and this is true in any business you're running, you need to show what you value if you want people to actually kind of work on it and commit time to it. You need to give it some space. Usually that involves something structural, like changing how you do assemblies.
Wow, this has been amazing. And what final thoughts would you have for our listeners today as they kind of think about applying everything that you just talked about into their world?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a big advocate for people reading widely and not necessarily thinking, I'm going to read this book because it's very obvious how it's going to help me. Try and discover and read in areas that it's not immediately obvious how it's going to be useful to you, but trust me, over time, you're going to draw on this stuff. Who knew during COVID, we'd have to draw on all our scientific knowledge that we'd learned at school years before. Those times will come again. And by definition, it'll be unexpected. If these problems are challenging, we're going to need unexpected answers, and we're going to have to do that from unexpected sources.
Absolutely. So good. Tell people how to find and follow you.
Yeah, so Edward Fidoe, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not actually on any of the other social media platforms, but LIS is. We are LIS. So definitely worth following us. Lots of great content from the LIS on all the different channels.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been amazing.
Thanks a lot.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. And remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.
Hey, my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Click on the link to learn more. And don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.